Hi. Well, having looked at the aerial view of the judgment of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18 in the last video, today we're going to come to the ground and begin to look at it up close in chapter 17, verses 1 to 6a. And as we do, we're going to hear a number of echoes of things we've heard earlier in Revelation, and a number of the charts I'll show you will show some of the echoes that we've seen. If you've not watched the earlier videos, you're certainly welcome to go back and hear those, and how what we're seeing now is the fulfillment and echo of much of what we've seen before. But there are also a number of key words in this section that the meaning of which has often been assumed to be understood but not actually analyzed to see what the meaning was. The key one of those is the the Greek word porneia, translated fornication here, which we'll look at in just a minute, but there are a couple of others as well. So as we begin to look at this, one of the issues that we need to be paying attention to is the relationship between the woman seated and the aspect of the city that we saw last time. So as we start, I just want to go over, to show you the issues we looked at in the last video, and if some of these trigger things for you, I just encourage you to watch that video if you haven't seen it already. And a couple of those have to do with the sexuality implied and sometimes explicitly stated here, at least in terms of the language of fornication or whoredom. So we looked at cities as whore and bride in Revelation and the implications of men like me talking about that and how to translate that into political and economic terms. And we looked at scholars on both sides of the issue of whether this should be seen as sexual violence against women or simply a metaphor we wouldn't use these days to describe political and economic destruction of a violent and repressive empire. So we looked at some of the background in the Hebrew Scripture, and we'll look at more of that as we go when we look at the specific Hebrew Scripture that are echoed. And we'll also see more as we go. I didn't really look at this in detail. The work from Glancy and more scholars here on the two different words in Greek that the Romans used to refer to women who are engaging in commercial sexual activity, porne and hetera, and that will be really important. And also we began to look at the relationship of the different symbolic women involved, Babylon, Roma, and others as we see. So that's the big picture, and I'll close that now to make room for what we're looking at. So as I showed you last time, and I'll just highlight it here briefly, the large section from 17:1 to the end of the book, Gregory Beale scholar has suggested this shape of a chiasm, but since we're going to be working in this section for a long time, we won't need to be paying attention to that. Rather, let's look at how this is shaped in terms of the scenes that unfold here. So, as I again showed last time, but we'll look at it more, here's the section we're going to be looking at today, and it starts with the vision, and then next time we'll begin into the angelic explanation, and then there'll be the pronouncement of judgment and the call to come out, the response of mourning from the kings and the merchants and the seafarers, and the call to celebrate, O heaven, saints and apostles and prophets. So we'll start here, back up here, and as we look at this, one of the key things to recognize is how every verse, almost every verse, is an echo of Hebrew Scripture. So as we can see here, right from the very beginning, this phrase, seated on many waters, has an implicit echo, at least, of Pharaoh standing on the Nile. And I'll go over some of these as we go, but we'll see that throughout this section, John is really taking pieces of Hebrew Scripture and making them into like a mosaic portrait of the reality in his time. So having said those things, let's begin to look at the language itself. So it begins then, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls. So we saw the angels of the seven bowls beginning in chapter 15, and some scholars have noted that this suggests that the Babylon judgment scene in 17 and 18 is simply a quote-unquote interlude, as we saw between the sixth and seventh seals earlier, and also in the trumpets. But we don't have to read it that way. We could simply say the seven bowls are completed, and now we have a new scene, and especially because this scene will be so closely parallel to New Jerusalem. I won't show those parallels now, but along the way we'll look closely at how tightly bound as opposites they are, like yin and yang, the descriptions of Babylon and New Jerusalem are. So the angel says to him, come, a regular refrain throughout Revelation for a new vision, and we'll see it a number of times in the scenes that come up here. I will show you, and the word for show here, dixo, has used a number of times, always for visionary experiences. And I really want to highlight that because it may seem obvious, but it can't be reproduced enough times that John is seeing a vision. That's why I highlighted in the chart here that this is a vision. This is not a description of events. It's not a prediction of the future. It's an apocalyptic vision. The veil has been lifted, and he's seeing what things are like from God's side of the veil. So nobody on earth is being affected by this. This is a vision he's seeing. And that will be emphasized in verse 3 when it says the angel carried him away in the spirit into a wilderness. Not literally into a wilderness, but in the spirit into a wilderness. Okay, so he will show you the judgment of the great whore. And curiously, perhaps this is the first time we're hearing the Greek word krina for judgment. We've heard other words about justice, and I showed a chart about that earlier, but the word krina is much closer to like verdict. You know, like the court has heard all the evidence and now is about to render a verdict. And that's what the angel is going to show John. The great whore here, the first time we're hearing of porne, and it'll be 4 times in this chapter, and it's certainly one of the key words, as you can see on the right side. And we'll look more later, but not quite yet, at the relationship between porne and hetera. But one thing I said last time that I'll just emphasize here is that porne referred to someone of low class, someone anonymous who had anonymous clients, whereas hetera was a courtesan, an upper-class woman who would be known and would have high status and would be publicly associated with men of status. And so there's a contradiction in the portrayal of Babylon between those two, but we have to look at the full portrait before we can see why those two terms are relevant. And we see that the whore is seated on many waters. And one of the curious things here is that in a couple of verses we hear other ways that the whore is seated. So let's look at these briefly. So here she's seated on many waters, but in 2 verses down, and you can see that on the screen as well, she's sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names with 7 heads and 10 horns. But a couple of verses down in 17:9, she's sitting on 7 mountains. And so how do we make the relationship between those? That's something we're going to have to see. There's plainly one person here, and so there's going to be some equivalence with what the things that she's shown in different elements seated on here. So the seated on, and that's the point with the parallel in Genesis 41. Most translations of Genesis 41 have, understandably, that Pharaoh is sitting by the Nile. But both in the Hebrew and the Greek, it's on the Nile, which of course doesn't make physical sense. But first of all, it's in a dream in Genesis 1, and so anything can make sense in a dream. But also it's to highlight his sovereignty, that he's on top of the Nile. And that's certainly the point here, that the woman is seated on many waters. And we see the echoes of many waters a number of times. Often it was the sound of many waters. And so we're going to see many times where the whore Babylon is in many ways a counterfeit, a substitute for the reign of God, and a cheap one at that, despite the gold and the purple and the scarlet that we're going to see. So she's seated on many waters, and we see here described with the kings of the earth. And an older scholar Mounts notes here, she stands for a dominant world system based on seduction for personal gain over against the righteous demands of a persecuted minority. At the close of history, the great prostitute stands as the final and intensified expression of worldly power. I want to highlight that because although I don't usually bring up quotes from older scholars because newer scholars have so changed the older interpretations, Mount's writing, I think in the 80s or maybe even the 70s, was already on top of the movement away from reading Revelation as about individual morality, about a prediction of the future, rather than being about an oppressive system at the time of John of Patmos. So some of the roots of the scholarship that I've been blessed with and worked with. And so we see the phrase kings of the earth, and that's a phrase we see regularly in Revelation. I didn't make a chart for them, but we'll see we've seen different groups of kings, a group of kings from the east and all the kings of the earth. So this is highlighting the global power of Babylon here. And this is where we get to the first of our key words we need to explore, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, translating the Greek word porneia. And one of the most challenging questions is, what does that mean? I want to focus on the more relatively recent work of Kyle Harper in this book here. Not a book, rather an article here you see from the Journal of Biblical Literature in 2012, The Making of a Christian Sexual Norm, is the subtitle of porneia. And that highlights the perspective he's using here, which is a little different than what I'm trying to do here. He's trying to establish what porneia means for Christians, mostly using the work of Paul, and he highlights a later Christian understanding in people like Clement of Alexandria or other explicitly Christian authors in the post-biblical world, follow Paul's letters and their interpretation, and Harper only makes a passing reference to fornication in Revelation. But what he does helpfully is show some of the Hebrew roots here. So I want to bring up a chart that shows porneia in the Bible, so we can see some of the point that Harper is trying to make. So here we have in the blue and white part the use of the noun porneia and the verb pornuo, often translated to practice fornication in the New Revised Standard that I'm using here, in Revelation. And I won't go through all those now. You can see it's quite a number of times in our Babylon section here. Earlier in the messages to the ecclesiae, once at the end of the trumpets, and here also about Babylon, the looking ahead of describing Babylon as fallen back in chapter 14. And I note here that of the noun, only 7 of 25 uses in the New Testament and Revelation. The verb, most of them here are in Revelation. And here are a couple other uses from the New Testament, highlighting, especially in Matthew and 1 Corinthians, this is plainly about literal human sexuality here. So Matthew in the context of men and adultery and divorce, and Paul in the context of the very specific example he gives here, a man living with his father's wife, which would say his stepmother. But what Harper helps us to hear is the older readings of porneia, like in the prophets Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or in this passage in 2 Kings, is the older meaning, which is to say, in the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew word zana, which meant prostitute, was from the beginning associated with idolatry. And we see that a number of times in the story of the 2 prostitutes and the son, in the Solomon story in 1 Kings 3, as I worked up and come out my people, but also in the prophets that we've been looking at, and especially in prophets like Hosea, where his metaphorical wife is a prostitute, as an example, substituting for Israel and Judah. So the prophets clearly use prostitution in this sense, and porneia as well. Porne as the noun for the person or the group in the case of Israel and Judah, but porneia or pornuo for what they're doing as idolatry. And it's plain that it's about the people as a whole and not about individuals. So explicitly in Jeremiah, in the time of King Josiah, that faithless one, Israel, went up after every high tree. So it's Israel as a people, and plainly that's true in Ezekiel about Jerusalem. So curiously, to get to the meaning of porneia in the Bible, we have to go back before Paul in the New Testament to hear that it originally meant idolatry. And so John of Patmos is taking up the prophetic meaning of it, and so we have to put aside the meaning of it that later developed in a Christian world that was much more concerned with individual salvation than the prophets or John is. So here the kings of the earth have committed fornication. It doesn't say with this woman on the beast as described at the moment. And already it's plainly a metaphor, because the whole group of kings of the earth, unless this is suggested as like group sex, which is certainly outside the bounds of any kind of image that we expect John to be giving, we know this is metaphorical. But it will be explicitly metaphorical in just a little while. So, and in addition to this, with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. And so fornication, again, wine we've seen a number of times, and we saw that earlier with the exact same quote. The inhabitants of the earth, a phrase that we see quite a number of times here. Here's a chart that shows that, and I've already posted that before, but just to remind you of that if you haven't seen it from the earlier verses. And of whom the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. And curiously, this is the only place in Revelation that this is used. A couple of verses down, a different word is used. This word here, methusko, means to make someone else drunk, as opposed to methuo in 17:6 is to become drunk oneself. So here it's showing the causal effect that the woman on the beast is causing the kings of the earth and all the inhabitants of it to become drunk on the wine of their fornication. At the moment it isn't described as blood, but we'll see in a little while it is. So having been told that, the angel carries John away in the Spirit, and we saw in the Spirit at the very beginning. We saw it here at the beginning of the first heavenly liturgy, the first revelation that John sees after the messages of the ecclesiae, and we'll see it in the end about New Jerusalem. So again, one of the parallels with Babylon and New Jerusalem is John is taken in the Spirit to see Babylon. It'll be taken in the Spirit to see New Jerusalem. Here into a wilderness or into a desert, which looking back matches with the woman clothed with the sun in 12:6. And for me, at least as an interpreter, I think that's really suggesting that this is not just an interlude in the bowls, but is a shift in scene here away. The very explicit reference that the angel is taking him away. So, and then once he's taken away, this is what he saw. The phrase, "and I saw," marks off a number of scenes here, as it did in 13 to 16. I won't go through all those, but you can see it's going to mark us off all the way through chapter 20. And what he sees is a woman here sitting on a scarlet beast. As Giblin notes, already it's contrary to what the angel had said, that she was seated on many waters. And so that's part of that 3 version that I already showed you here. So she's sitting here on the beast, and always helpful to have a quote from Elul here, who notes, she rests in her historic actuality upon the political power, and it is the political power that will destroy her. The word for scarlet here, kokanon, links her with both the beast rising from the sea that we saw earlier and with the dragon. Used in a different word, there, puros is read, but kukanos is used for the beast from the sea, as well as with the 7 heads and 10 horns. So we'll see that collection here. So she is riding on the beast rising from the sea. It's full of blasphemous names. And the word for full of is an unusual word. Gemo is the root verb here. It's used in this next verse to contrast that while the beast is full of blasphemous names, her cup is full of abominations in the impurities of her fornication. It makes sense to talk about a cup being full, but how could a beast be full of names? And that suggests that the names are on the outside of the beast, much like we heard earlier in 4, 6, and 8, and I'll go back to that to see the 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. That sense of full of saying they're on the surface, that you can see them all around. And so in that similar sense here, the scarlet beast full of blasphemous names to say the names are on the beast. What those names are, we don't know. But again, Ulul helps us here with the quote down below. Covered with blasphemous names does not signify, has been said too often, participation in the imperial cult. These are rather the designations of powers who pretend to reproduce the truth of God by reversing it. We must not forget that the first meaning of blasphemy is to defame. And so that's the implication here, that the names on the beast are defaming God, whether those are the names of other goddesses like Roma that we'll see, or Cybele, the chief earth mother goddess of the people in Roman Asia, and before it was Roman Asia, or John doesn't tell us. But he also says that it had 7 heads and 10 horns, which is what matches it both with the dragon and the sea beast, and also echoes the beast from Daniel, as we can see on our charts of the Hebrew scripture echoes, which I can go back to here, and you can see those as we go too. And so having seen the beast that she's sitting on, now we get a close-up view of her. And as Kester notes, this scathing parody of elegance is revolting and designed to startle readers into recognizing the character of the ruling power. And indeed, that is the case. So let's look at it up close and see the details of that. The woman is clothed, literally wrapped around parabolo, and I've posted this before, but I'll show it to you now. Clothing in Revelation and all the different ways that people are clothed, which is to highlight what they're protected by, and also what they're revealing to others. The clothes we wear tell other people who we think we are in relation to others, whether that's fashion or practicality or status or whatever that might be. And so we see down here the purple and scarlet, and we'll see the city clothed the same way because, of course, they're the same reality. In contrast with the Lamb and others and those who are faithful in white robes, etc. So the white will be contrasted with the red throughout here, and the purple as well. So she's clothed in purple and scarlet. As Kester notes, tyranny was depicted as a woman wearing purple and scarlet to cloak her oppressive practices. And this is the beginning of what we'll need to be looking at to see how Glancy and Moore's distinction between porne and hetera is key. Because many scholars, including myself when I was working on Unveiling Empire more than 20 years ago, assumed that this meant a high-class prostitute because of the purple and scarlet and the gold and jewels and all those things. But what Glancy and Moore have helped us to see is this is dress-up. This is not her usual attire, because she's described as a porne, which is a low-class person. So this is like someone who normally would be dressed in whatever rag she has, but is invested by perhaps the head of her brothel or her own work to try to appear as something that she's not, to appeal to customers. And purple, of course, being a royal color, and scarlet, as we've seen, is matching both the beast and the dragon as well. Adorned with gold, which is simply mean made of gold, so the highlighting the gold doubly here. And we saw gold and jewels and pearls earlier in the message, and we'll see it again as part of the cargo. And so what we're seeing is she's clothed with the very things that the merchants and the seafarers have brought back through the imperial economy, which makes perfect sense. To the extent she represents the empire, Rome in this case, but empire more broadly, the empire is clothed with the fruit of its immoral commerce, with its imperial intercourse. The word for jewels here literally means precious stones, and we'll see that again. And New Jerusalem will have jewels as well, and gold and pearls. Again, that'll be part of the contrast. Pearls is, if you're not familiar, is the word margarita. So next time you go to a Mexican restaurant, maybe you could order a glass of pearls and see if they get the joke. She's holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. As Molina notes, images of gods and goddess with a cup in one hand with the other raised generally depict a posture of blessing. And as Ulul adds, she does what God does. She claims to establish a communion as God does. here's an image of a golden cup from the 1st century, exactly this time, and you see that it's pictured with the many things on it, which is again suggests the fullness here, like the fullness of the beast names, is on the outside. And so we aren't told what's on the cup, but it suggests not necessarily what's in the cup, but what's on the cup. And the abominations here, bedulgma, which is a standard word for things that can't be named, like in Daniel 9, 11, and 12, something that is so horrifying, much like we might say the N-word today, things that cannot be spoken out loud. In Daniel, it refers to images of the Greek king, and perhaps that's exactly what John has in mind here, is images of the emperor or of the Roman goddesses. And the uncleanness of her fornication, akatharta there, impurities or uncleanness, which again, we don't think of it that way, but has some implication of the sexual metaphor in the way we use the word adulterated in English. We certainly don't mean it's a sexual word to say that something is adulterated with impurities. It means it's something that's supposed to be one thing, has other things in it. It's not its pure self. And in this case, not purely God, but the impurities of the immoral and oppressive and violence-based intercourse. Then we see on her forehead written a name. And older scholars took the writing on her forehead as perhaps a headband, but this is where not just Glancy and Moore, but people they've worked with like classicist C.P. Jones helps us. He notes that the portrayal imagines the woman not only as a whore, but as a whore of the most degraded kind, a tattooed slave, which is to say, this is a tattoo on her forehead, much like as we saw in forehead markings earlier, people marked with the image of the beast, suggesting they're slaves of empire, and that's what's being suggested here, that she's a slave, and it's being told to everyone who she is, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and the earth's abomination. That's the label that is on her for all to see. The word for mystery here is used differently in Revelation than it is for Paul, who uses it as something that really can't be explained, but here it is explained, and it'll be explained by the angel, as we'll see in the next video in the next scene. So Babylon the Great is the first time we're hearing this here, and I showed last time great. I'll just put it up briefly here so you can see how the Greek word megas for great is used so many times in this section here. So this is the first of those. Babylon the Great, mother of whores. We need to look at this a little bit. And this is Kester here noting, in ordinary practice, an older prostitute trained younger girls, outfitting the girls with the necessary clothing and makeup. If she purchased slaves in order to prostitute them, she might call them her own daughters, so that the customers would think the girls were free-born and pay higher prices. So in other words, she's spawning a whole group of whores, and perhaps that's symbolic of the nations that have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So it's not just Babylon, but all, if you would, the client nations and all the kings surrounding. And of course, in the imperial context, that would include colonies and clients, people who are choosing to be in relationship with the center, with the imperium, because there's benefit to them, and those who've been colonized by violence and domination. So finally, we're going to look at one last phrase before we stop for today. And I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. And now we get to the inside of the cup. And this is where, having caused other people to be drunk, now we see that she's drunk. And this is highlighting, of course, many echoes from the Hebrew Scripture. We see this from Isaiah here. And so this is the reality. Her mind is no longer subject to rationality, and that's the implication of drunkenness, because of the violence which has consumed her. And when he saw this, he was greatly amazed. And we'll see there's something ironic and perhaps even sardonic about that when we get to the next video, when the angel tells John, don't be amazed, and explains to him what this vision is. See you for that next time. Bye.